As you know, June is Pride Month. Happy Pride, everyone, wherein we celebrate LGBTQIA+ community and the members of that community. This community has contributed so much to build the America we live in today, and we will explore that in tonight's discussion. And they have been here since the foundations have been laid. This is not a topic that we can do justice to in 1 hour, so I look forward to exploring this history more, not just in June, but year-round. Because as Tony Kushner wrote in Angels in America, the world only spins forward. We will be citizens. The time has come. You are fabulous creatures, each and every one, and I bless you. More life. The great work begins. So I'd like to start that work here today by a wonderful panel discussion with two panelists. One panelist, Dr. Kara French, had an unexpected situation arise and she won't be able to join us, but we are going to have an amazing discussion to forward this great work and by celebrating, seeing, and exploring the legacies of the LGBTQIA+ community in colonial America with two amazing panelists. With that, I am humbled to introduce our guests tonight. We have Professor Michael Bronski. He is an independent scholar, journalist, and writer who has been involved in social justice movements since the 1960s. He has been active in gay liberation as a political organizer, writer, publisher, and theorist since 1969. He is the author of numerous books, including a Queer History of the United States, which won the 2011 American Library Association's Stonewall Israel Fisherman Award for Best Nonfiction. And in 2014, he published You Can Tell Just by Looking and 20 Other Myths About LGBT Life and People. In 2019, he published A Queer History of the United States for Young People, and he is a professor of the practice in activism and media and the studies of women, gender, and sexuality at Harvard University. And then we have Professor Megan Rhodes Victor. Professor Victor is an anthropologist who specializes in historical archaeology from the 17th century through the 19th century. In particular, they're interested in commensal politics, drinking spaces, trade and exchange, informal economy, and gendered spaces. Dr. Victor has worked extensively on archaeology at the fishing village and trading post on Smuttynose Island with the Isles of Shoals, Maine, Virginia's colonial capital of Williamsburg, including the 18th century Raleigh Tavern, a favorite of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And sites throughout the 17th century and 18th century Chesapeake Bay. It is within the Atlantic world and the English colonial world that most of their research currently takes place. The Molly House Project, which is amazing, go to their website, look it up. It is so, so cool. And other geographic focus of Dr. Victor's research is that of the American West with an eye to the mining frontiers of the 19th century. Dr. Victor received their BA from anthropology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan, their MA in 2012, and their PhD in 2018, both from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And Dr. Victor is currently an assistant professor at Queens College-CUNY. I'm very jealous because, as many of you know, I just moved here from New York, and I'm very homesick for everything Dr. Victor gets to experience in New York, all my favorite restaurants. So thank you both for joining us, and we hope to see Dr. French in the future. And to our esteemed audience members, if you have questions for our panelists, please, please, please ask them. We love questions. Questions are fantastic. Please ask the questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll pull them out. But we only have a less than an hour now to delve into something really, really fascinating. So I want to start by setting up a vocabulary for us all as we work through tonight's discussion, if you will, a vocabulary of understanding how we should approach this material. So how do we begin to approach the study of who we consider today to be LGBTQIA+ individuals in colonial America, when that society didn't have the same understanding of sexual orientation, gender identity, etc., as we do today? What do we have to be aware of as we navigate this landscape? I pass it to my experts. Dr. Bronski, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I think it's so easy to be presentist and to take what we experience every day back into the past. I think for me, when I was writing the book particularly, the main thing was to really judge the past by Megan, Dr. Victor will host this, by what we can find of it, by letters, by artifacts, and try to understand these people in their own terms, right? So one question that came up when I wrote queer history was, can we say that a man who was having sex with men was gay, or a homosexual, if the words did not even exist at that point, right? And we said, no, you can't, which I think is the historically correct thing to do. But it was a matter of then understanding what that meant to the people. And I think that goes for any, because many of the people, as we do today, led very complicated lives. And we don't want to gloss that over by giving them a label, but you don't want to avoid the complications in their lives as well.
I think we also need to be aware that we can't put our modern perspectives completely onto it, but we also, for a long time there was this thought, well, our modern perspectives are as deep as they go, right? And that led to the erasure, in a way, of the LGBT community by saying, well, they literally weren't there, and that obviously is contradicting the very title of this webinar, right? Which is that they were here, right? And so, we have a record, from 1707, right, in England, that is referring to those kind of people called the sodomites, and then it literally goes on to list basically a practice and an underworld, as they refer to it, and they describe it like a criminal underworld because it was a crime to be homosexual at the time, and they describe it, but there's this thriving community. They discuss where they meet. They discuss certain terms that can be used to identify someone else in the community and various things like this. And so this is sort of like a tell-all that was done at the gallows. And it was sort of assumed that you were telling the truth if you had nothing to lose. But a lot of this has been corroborated by other sort of gallows confessions. And so the fact that, this precedes some of the notions that Foucault was saying, and that's really important, right? They did see themselves as a community. And we need to not forget that, even as we're careful with our terminology.
Right. And I think going off of that, right, that one way that we can actually begin this research and begin this archival experience, right, is through a negative lens of looking at laws, right? I mean, I suspect that no one's going to pass laws that are against things that don't happen. Right. So if you have sodomy laws, clearly somebody's committing sodomy. If you have adultery laws, clearly people are actually committing adultery.
And so often they even bring up things, going back to that same sort of thing. There was another one that was passed in 1709, bemoaning the fact that these knots and gangs still meet. And so by saying still meet, they sort of imply that this is still happening. You can't still happen unless something had happened previously, right? So this isn't the first time, you can't bemoan a continued thing unless it had already started previously.
Can you talk a little bit about the as we had discussed in our little pre-show, that how we're defining sex versus sexuality in historical context, i.e. an act versus a behavior, because I feel like we're narrowing into that by starting to talk about the community and people who may have defined themselves in the community through actions or actions that stand alone.
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing to sort of acknowledge is that human beings throughout history and prehistory have had sex in many, many ways, and that nothing's new, and that, nothing was invented in 1750 or when the Bugbery Act was passed in 1533 in England, it didn't invent buggery, which was a word for sodomy. So I think, the record shows, right, and Megan will be able to speak to this, right, the record shows that we actually have convictions for people committing or engaging in, committing is a loaded word, engaging in same-sex activities, which I would consider sexual activity. Did they have an identity around this? Clearly in some of the Molly houses they did, and they formed communities. clearly there were cases in America, of sodomy trials in, I have the dates here somewhere, 17 something, which did not end in a conviction, right? But it was William Sessions, a man who actually had multiple charges of sodomy against him, often coerced with younger men or with men who were in lower station. Did he see himself as part of a community? I suspect maybe not, but he was engaging in the activity. So I think we have to make a distinction between act and identity.
And there's also the notion of, a lot of the terminology that's used is going to be really crucial to understanding how people saw themselves. And so when we're looking both for materiality, when we're looking for laws, when we're looking for, excuse the noise in the background if you can hear it, sorry, the joys of living in New York. But one of the things that we see a lot is this word effeminacy. And in the late 18th century or the late 17th century, there's sometimes a slight implication that maybe it means more than just weak. And of course, we can get into the whole nonsense of, why is it that comparing something to a woman means weak, but okay. But from 1720 to 1750, in particular, throughout the English colonial world, the number of newspaper references to the word effeminacy that mean or refer to acts of sodomy, people who are homosexual, skyrockets. And by 1750, you really cannot use the word effeminate or effeminacy to mean anything other than a homosexual. And so when you read that, you have to read underneath homophobia too, that's in there. And so there are societies that are formed to protect people from drunkenness and effeminacy, from gambling and effeminacy and things like that. And they're not hoping to protect people from women. They're not hoping to protect people from weakness. They're hoping to protect people from homosexuality, from this threat to manliness. And, as far as, is there a community, is there things like that? This effeminacy was also taken with and ran with at times. We have people like Princess Seraphina, who is the first recognizable drag queen in English history, and she never gets convicted at all. And everyone refers to her as Princess Seraphina. She's mentioned in 2 different court cases in 1728 and in 1732, and she's not the victim of either of them. One of them, she's accusing someone of stealing her clothing, and she loses. The guy gets acquitted, but there's no punishment for her losing it. Everyone refers to her as Princess Seraphina, even though it's known that by name they were John Cooper. And one of the most famous, testimonies that we have about Mollies in the homosexual community in 1728 that comes from the highwayman John Dalton. He mentions Seraphina just sort of offhandedly before, this is his sort of gallows testimony. But again, it's just sort of like, oh yeah, and she was there. And also it's a man, so there's this notion of effeminacy taken one step further. And that aligns a little bit with our views today, right, of using she, her pronouns for drag queens and things like that. The fact that even when she was out of drag, John Cooper was referred to as Princess Seraphina. These are things that are actually surprisingly modern, right? Things we wouldn't necessarily expect for the 1730s.
So just real quick, because I want to make sure that our very esteemed audience, who some of them may be familiar, some of them not, can we talk about what the word Molly meant, what a Molly house is, so that because I think we're going to be bringing this up a lot in the next couple minutes or so. So just to make sure everybody's aware.
Absolutely. I don't know if you want me to continue that, or if you want, I'm happy to defer.
Oh, I'm happy for I can work my way through it, but I think Megan's far more conversant with it than I am.
So Molly houses were safe spaces for gay men and for cross-dressing individuals in the 18th century English colonial world. In England, particularly London, they existed in a wide variety of different places, and we actually find them in sort of all different echelons of society. Originally, it was thought that these were only for people that couldn't afford to hire a private room, where if you wanted to sort of have, you know, sort of same-sex relations, if you could afford it, you could have a private room, it would be fine. Otherwise, you had to go to a Molly house. But the more that we've dug into this, the more we realize there's this deeper community to it. And so we actually have evidence from people all the way from dukes down to common blacksmiths and such, were definitely all within the same place. And we actually have certain names that people would use to signal that they were Mollies. So sort of the common name of Susanna, which was Suki, was taken a lot if you were a Molly. So we have that. If you referred yourself as aunt or mother, this frequently referred to the fact that you were cross-dressing. And then we had people that showed up at Molly houses who were interested in interacting with drag queens, but stayed in very male dress. And so that's, you know, so Molly houses were these safe spaces. They were in back rooms, they were upstairs, and they were sometimes in the upper rooms of boarding houses as well.
Also, I think it, for people who have never heard the term, Molly is a variant of Mary, and it probably begins the gay male, what we'd call gay male today, tradition of referring to one another by female names, whether the person was cross-dressing or not, right? I mean, certainly when I was coming out, you would refer to people in a bar, oh, yeah, oh, Mary, stop it. A tradition that probably goes back to 1710.
That is fascinating. That is so fascinating. Okay, so one of the first big questions that I had on the list that I had sent out for us to discuss, and I feel like we're getting into the topic quite easily now, is what were the general colonial attitudes towards sexuality, towards gender, and did those attitudes at all shift in America over the course of original settlement to the time of the Revolution? Did we see thinking shift in any seismic sort of way in this new world?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great question. It's really complicated. I think just as a basis where we should begin by recognizing that when the colonies began to separate from Great Britain, right, there was a which is 1740, 1750, before the Revolution, 1776, right, that there was an urge to form a different culture, right? So whatever the attitudes were in England, we were going to go and move in a different way. So, and this is about gender. It's about Webster's dictionary, where Webster wants to recreate the English language for Americans. Right. There's a play, the first play produced and written in America, called The Contrast, which is 1787, in which a young woman is being courted by Billy Dimple, who is a British loyalist and very effeminate, not homosexual, but very effeminate. And his rival, the contrast, is Colonel Manley. So already we're seeing this sort of, it's pretty simple metaphors here. We're seeing this. So I think that, I mean, it always struck me that the Puritans are to some degree, and I'm sure Megan would more say this, somewhat misunderstood, right? They understood the importance of sex. They understood the importance of sex in a community. They understood the importance of having children. They downplayed, there's a great line in Thomas Macaulay's History of the English People, where he says that, speaking of London, that the Puritans banned the practice of bear baiting, which is to have a bear chained up and bait the bear, right? That the Puritans banned the playing of bear baiting, not because it was bad for the bear, but because it gave people pleasure, right? And also the Puritans were a dissenter group, right? And you have to remember, the Puritans that came to America could have seen some of Shakespeare's plays with all their obscene puns and their rowdiness back in London at the Globe Theatre. So they really are sort of rejecting that when they come here. Megan, do you want to follow up on that?
To me, it's very interesting what we have. As an archaeologist, I'm always looking at what people put to paper and then what they actually do, because what we put to paper and what we do rarely are the same thing, either because we're hoping to get away with something, right? And hoping we don't get caught, or just because we forget, or, all kinds of minutiae slip through the lines. But it's always interesting to me to look at what are on the books for the colonies.
Mm-hmm.
And, speaking of the Puritans, right, Plymouth adopts a sodomy law in 1636. And Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut and Rhode Island quickly follow, but we don't actually get a lot of trials. And so there's a big difference between putting something on the books
Mm-hmm.
and pretty early versus actually doing something about it, right? And so that's sort of the first thing that's really worth kind of bearing in mind. There's other ones like Maryland adopts right away. It just says it's going to adopt English law, which means that inherently it brings in the buggery law from England, as it was called. But then something must happen. We don't have a court case for it, but they feel the need to reiterate that sodomy is bad. And so in 1691, they make a special specific, please don't do this law, even though they had already, upon founding, stated that they were going to do this, that they were going to follow England's laws. So something must have happened, and yet we don't have court cases to go with it. The most prolific, or one of the most prolific places we have is actually in New York. And it's under Dutch rule that we get 3 court cases and 2 hangings. And then once New York comes under English law, they make a really big deal about having sodomy laws on the books. They go through several different ratifications of it through 4 different volumes of laws, but we don't get any more actual court cases that are open with hangings. So what's going on? Why do we have something where we have to keep putting it on the books again and again and again and give lip service to it almost, but then we don't actually see it in the courts?
Right. I mean, that really speaks to some degree, the law being performative, almost sort of a wish list, right? Versus what people are doing. So it seems to me that one explanation might be that, and we have to realize, right, that these colonies are comprised of small towns, often with not many people in them. You really don't want to begin prosecuting people where it may lead you to actually prosecuting lots of people that would actually hurt the entire community. So you may be better off either ignoring it or making sure that it just stops quietly, which means that it's sort of lost to the historical record. Unfortunately, right? I'm not advocating more hangings, but that would give us evidence, right? I mean, the other thing, right, is that many of the cases, and I'm sure Megan can speak to this, right, that if you're a wealthy landowner in Connecticut, and this is the case with William Sessions, I think his name is, repeated offenses, repeated warnings, and when it gets really bad, they say, if you do it once more, we're going to take your land away from you. And there are some other cases around the same time where the person is a servant and he's caught and he's hanged. So not unlike today, rich people can get away with more.
So I think that was one of my later questions was that I think maybe we're finding our way there, and what were generally the risks that folks would have undertaken to either engage in behavior or live as authentically as they could? What were those risks that those individuals undertook? And were there certain colonies or areas that were safer? We're talking about there weren't a lot of court cases, but we do see a lot of laws. How do we weigh that to gauge safety in the 21st century looking back? And did those risks differ between economic statuses?
It was terrifying to be a member of the LGBT community in the 18th century. You could be killed, and not just could be killed by people that thought that what you were doing was wrong, right? You couldn't just be killed by small-mindedness and homophobia, right? In terms of the way that we see hate crimes, but literally it was legal and it was seen as good and just to kill people who were caught being gay. And this includes cross-dressing, and yet as we talked about, Princess Seraphina ended up being fine. But as far as what was it like, it was a capital crime because it was on the English law books as being a capital crime. And then the 13 colonies sort of chose what they wanted to do with it. And 12 of the 13 had a sodomy law. Only Georgia had no law about it. And the reason they didn't is because England did. It actually had nothing to do really with them being more progressive about homosexuality, but they basically were so mad at the existence of all these English laws, and they were a debtor colony, that the English or the colonial legislature in Georgia went so far as to criminalize any statement that anyone made saying English law was enforced there. They were that mad about it, right? But they are founded in 1732, so pretty far forward when already people are starting to agitate to want to break away. So 12 of the 13 had a sodomy law, and it was a capital crime in 11, right? Only Pennsylvania made it a jailing offense only. And that soon became a capital crime once more English influence and less Quaker influence entered into Pennsylvania. So a punishment that was originally no more than 6 months then became capital too, until the only place you couldn't be killed for being gay was Georgia. In fact, though, the safest places for you to be in were in the South, which is absolutely contrary to what we think now, and kind of is different from what you were saying. You know, how do we approach these concepts now? How do our modern concepts sort of feed in? We think so much of today of places like New York being or Boston, right, being safe cities for homosexuality, and it was very much not the case in the colonial period, right? So North and South Carolina and Georgia were the safe places to be.
Yeah, I think another thing people may not realize that's really important to realize is that this all comes from what Megan referred to, I think it's 1533, the English buggery law under Henry VIII. But that English common law, right, that English law was actually based upon canon law. So all these prohibitions are actually religious in nature. I mean, they morph over time and they change fit the situation or fit the colony or fit what's going on in England. But they are all religious in their origins. I mean, the other thing is that, right, there's an interesting, and I think Megan's completely correct, right, that you could be killed if you were caught, right? Unless you were rich, then you got warnings before you got caught again, right? But there's an interesting case. There's a professor, a student at Harvard who becomes a tutor, and then he's up to be president, but he doesn't accept it. Michael Wigglesworth. There's actually a dormitory called Wigglesworth Dormitory. And it's interesting to look at it in his diary where he's very religious, and he actually speaks about his filthy, lustful thoughts for his young students who are kind of 2 years younger than him. And there's a great essay by Alan Bray, English historian, right, an English cultural historian, who argues that his distress is not so much the act itself, because the act of lust is a human act, sinful and illegal, but a human act. His real transgression was that he was feeling so deeply for the students, and that was a feminine emotion. Right. So these things, I mean, this was Michael Wigglesworth's interior, what's the word I want? His interior experience of this was actually, what was transgressive was actually the excess of emotion. And he, of course, knew that actually, lustful thoughts for a male student were actually wrong and sinful. But you can't separate out in the Puritan imagination, the different impulses that people may have.
It's so heartbreaking when you think of it in the course of like a 20th century mindset. It's very hard not to become emotional about hearing these stories, and somebody, like, again, as Megan said, put pen to paper. When you think about the actual pen to paper in a private action, it's very, very heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about early trans Americans? Did the ability, or trans as we may know trans today, did the ability to enter a new world, to go on a transformative journey and start your life fresh in a way that we can't imagine today, and present yourself differently through a new world. Was that something that was open to some people that we have on record, people coming here and living as a gender that they were not assigned to at birth?
I know of one case of during the Civil War in the 1850s of Albert Cashier. We do know of cross-dressing, I mean, the case that comes to mind, right, is Jemima Wilkinson, who actually is a woman who is born assigned female at birth, is related to Quakerism and raised partially Quaker, comes down with typhus, I believe, almost dies, has visions of Christ coming to her, and is reborn. I'll change my pronouns, and I don't even want to say they, because Jemima Wilkinson is reborn as public universal friend and uses no pronouns whatsoever, not even they. So it's a rare case of somebody, and I don't even want to say that Friend was what we would call transgender, because Friend was actually, it was a mystical experience. I mean, what some historians argue is that Friend took the Paul's letters to the Corinthians, I think, saying, in Christ there is neither Gentile nor Jew nor male nor female, and Friend took neither male nor female to heart.
Wow, that is incredible.
Yes.
Public universal friend.
And
wow.
Clearly influenced by Quakerism and clearly influenced by different religions. And I would argue, right, that as the 1775, 1774, the colonies are actually evolving, and Friend was actually inventing a new religion for America. And before we get too happy about Friend forbid all sexuality. Friend was not across the board. Friend had a lot of other religious doctrines we wouldn't agree with.
Friend had, it sounds like Friend had a rich tapestry. There was a rich tapestry.
Yes. Yeah.
We just got a great question in from the chat that I want to make sure that we get before we move on. And it says, thank you, James, for this wonderful question. Did parts of America that had non-English influences, for example, Louisiana or Hispanic areas, have different LGBTQ plus historical experience?
I'm happy to speak to it. I can also defer.
Megan, take it.
Yeah. So there's sort of an interesting phenomenon that takes place regarding sort of what's seen as sexuality. And again, this is going to be much more with the view of sort of male sex, rather than sort of looking at woman sex, just because it was less prosecuted, right? And so as a result, we know less about it because it was just seen as less problematic. There are certainly cases, but so what we see is that at about 1700 in sort of England and France, and this does get back to the question, in England and France in particular, right, we see this sort of shift where all of a sudden it's really not a good thing to be at all interested in male sex, no matter the age. Whereas previously, if someone was seen as an adolescent boy, if you were a man, you could be interested in women and adolescent boys, and that was still okay. And then by about 1700, we see this trend where all of a sudden in the literature and the laws, you couldn't. So despite the buggery laws that were in the books and then sort of reenacted by Elizabeth I, people didn't really care until about 1700. This trickles its way across Europe at different rates. And this affects the colonies that are connected to these various European sort of these countries, what we would think of now as nations, although that's a 19th century term. And so as a result, we have much more lenient views, despite the fact that a lot of countries may, purport to being very religious and things like that. We have a lot more lenient views toward homosexuality in the Mediterranean, on the Iberian Peninsula, and in Eastern Europe. And so anywhere that's sort of connected with them is going to have a different experience. In fact, there's one country in particular that England keeps picking on, which is odd because they're actually an ally. But England consistently picks on Portugal for homosexuality. There's all kinds of things. So they were allied, especially at sea. They were two big naval powers. And at one point, during several different trials, at one point there's this thing comes up and it's like, why did you do it? Why did you have sex with other sailors? And they're like, the Portuguese made us. And they're like, well, what do you mean? They're like, well, they were just very Portuguese, and so we became gay. And they're like, that doesn't make any sense. And yet we see it again and again. And then there's another thing where someone is talking about, it's in the 1760s. He's doing a just sort of a tour through Spain and Portugal. And the one thing that keeps completely surprising him is that men are seen with men and women are seen with women, and they are engaging in like holding each other's hands, and they're kissing, and this is abhorrent, right? So their colonies are connected that way too. So Portuguese colonies, Spanish colonies are going to have the same trickle down effect that we're seeing in sort of the English colonies, right? So the French colonies are going to have a similar kind of phenomenon that we're getting with the English colonies, whereas Spanish and Portuguese colonies are going to have a much more lax approach until about the 19th century. Then everything locks down really tight.
Wow.
I just want to introduce a sort of macro framework here that it's quite, my students are always amazed by this, right? I believe it's 1787, France, after the revolution, France gets rid of their sodomy laws, along with, oddly, Andorra, a small country people never think about. And and England doesn't really get rid of theirs till the Wolverhampton Act in 57, and they're not taken off the books till 67. In the meantime, other countries are dropping them. Many more countries begin to drop them after that. America doesn't get rid of their laws until 2003 with Lawrence v. Texas. Literally centuries later.
And in a way that sort of fits that colonial history. In a way, we're talking about, how do we make ourselves different from England? We actually see, as we get closer and closer to revolution, more and more sodomy laws come on the books in various colonies, right? So when the Carolinas are first established, there's no sodomy law at all for 50 years. And then they put one on, and then they get more and more conservative as they get closer and closer to revolution, almost as things seem to somewhat get a little bit more lax, and England may want to separate about it. And something that actually happens right during the height of this sort of revolutionary fervor that rocked the entire English-speaking world and anyone who could read English was the trial of Captain Robert Jones. And he was he's also the person, by the way, that invented ice skating. Just for what it's worth, right? But he was put on trial in theory, for sodomizing a 13-year-old boy. And it started a huge debate, much larger than anyone really expected, because it basically brought up what it meant to be English, what it meant to be either homosexual or not, what effeminacy was, and whether his crime was that it was a boy, or that it was someone who was male, or just that it was someone who was young. Like, would it have been a problem if it was a 13-year-old girl? Would it have been a problem if it was a 33-year-old man? And all of this became a raging thing. We started to get all these pamphlets defending homosexuality, talking about how John Locke says that only an individual can own their own body. So how dare there be laws stating that we shouldn't be in control of our own body? People start bringing in Enlightenment philosophy. And so all of this is taking place. And this is 1772.
I know we only have about 15 minutes left in our discussion. So I want to make sure that we talk about something really important, which is the insight into friendship. A lot of this research that's been going on, friendship is used as a reference point between relationships with two men or two women. It's always this notion of friendship. How has our understanding of friendship evolved? And did friendship in colonial America imply a certain degree of intimacy that we no longer maybe associate with the term? Now we say a friend is like my bro that I have a beer with, versus what did a friend mean in 1770?
Yeah, I mean, certainly people had friends that they had beers with. Certainly, I think a linguistic decision you might want to make is friendship versus romantic friendship. And people use the term romantic friendship not to mean actually friends with benefits or leading to sex, but an intense emotional relationship, right? So, I mean, we see this to some degree there are letters between George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette, that we have the Marquis de Lafayette's letters to Washington, and they've been separated. They were intensely close, fighting in this country together. The Marquis goes back to France, and he writes these heartbreaking letters saying, "I haven't heard from you," and they're clearly, there's no evidence that they ever had a sexual relationship, of course, but they clearly had an intense emotional one. I mean, to the point that actually the Marquis de Lafayette named his son after George Washington, and in his will wanted to be buried with dirt from Mount Vernon over his coffin. Right. So how do we read these, right? Do we read them as they were just really, really close guy friends? But I mean, I think, or is there something else going on? And I think what's going on is that in a society in which the sexes were completely lived in different spheres, right? That these emotional friendships between women and between men were actually quite normal and natural. And I suspect many involve sexual behaviors, maybe. But the very notion of the romantic friend or the intimate friend is something that we don't have today, even though people may experience it in their lives. Megan, did you want to follow up on that?
Oh, sure. I know that it's often, context is important too, because it is something that we don't necessarily have as a term, or that's weighted the same way. Yeah. But there were often concerns that would be put in the public newspapers. So there's one dating again, this comes from London, but there's one dating to 1723 that basically warns people about a group of individuals that seem to take pride in feminine airs. And that's like one quote. And then the other thing is that the way that you can notice them, they said, is by their caresses and fondness for each other. And we can see that they are platonic. They refer to them, this being a noun, who have contracted friendship, is how they talk about it, right? And then they said that they have grown enamored of one another. And they're referring to these men. And then it continues to say, basically, if we knew of the secret debaucheries of what they did in their intimacies, we would be startled at it. And that they were doing flagrant things that were the epitome of Sodom, it ends. Right. And so, but they've contracted friendship, right? Almost as if it's a disease or things like that. They've contracted this strong emotion, they've contracted effeminacy. And so these foppish men, and yet it's talking about a group, right? And a lot of these other court cases are talking about knots or groups or clusters. And what this shows again and again, and it's really fitting for Pride, right, is that even in the 18th century, people were looking for community. And that's, we're talking about the nature of friendship, that it may not have the same weight then, but the whole point is that, the reason this whole ring of Molly houses existed both in England and in her colonies is that there were people who recognized that there were others like them who liked cross-dressing, who liked same-sex company, acts of sex, whatever it may be, wherever you are on that scale or spectrum, and they were looking for other people. There's something really powerful about knowing that you're not alone, that you're not broken, that you're not the only one like that, especially when you're operating under capital punishment. And so seeing all of this term of friendship, the fact that it was, it's sort of perverted in a way to mean almost something problematic. It's painful, and yet they at times would use it. They would refer to one another as their particular friend and almost take it back the way that, we have taken back queer and we've taken back gay and things like that. Yeah. And go ahead.
Oh, I mean, this also intersects or interacts with the notion of how do we read primary source documents, right? And if there are plenty of romantic friendships between women from from actually the Renaissance on. And the trajectory in sort of feminist scholarship, right, has been early on, I was thinking of people like before Carol Smith Rosenberg, right? They'd say, well, these are passionate friends. Nancy Cott comes and says, well, we don't know if they had a physical relationship or not. Possibly not. But when you get a little bit later with somebody like Blanche Weisencook, and Blanche Weisencook says, well, I'm going to judge it if I have, letters saying I love you, I need you, I want you, I can't wait to be with you in a physical way. And if it's between a man and a woman, and we're going to see them as being sexual, I'm going to use that same interpretation if it's two men or two women. It's the same period, the same language, right? So part of this really speaks to a sort of equity of how we look at homosexuality versus heterosexuality, but also this sort of evolution within scholarship of how we actually read these letters, right? And how we look at the archive and how we actually interpret it, and then changes. I mean, I've been following this scholarship, since 1970, and it's changed enormously over 50 years in terms of what we look for and how we understand it.
That's so exciting about the evolution still today. It makes something from the past seem so much more alive when we have a evolving perspective on it. I want to get us a little bit off topic, because here at Revolutionary Spaces, we really believe in the voice of the people, and who am I not to celebrate that by taking another question from the Q&A box. This is a little off topic, and Megan, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation here. Can you speak to the matelotage? I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
Matelotage. I didn't do very well in French in high school.
No, you're fine.
The pirate community off the coast of 17th century America. Matelotage. Got it. Can we speak to that? As I have no idea what that is.
I'm also happy to defer if you want. If not, I'll answer.
Oh, no, you go, Megan. Then I have something that I'm sure that I want to add on to what you said. If you explain the basics of it.
Sure. So this is definitely something that I find rather exciting. My master's was on the archaeology of piracy. So basically, there was a pirate community that existed off the coast of 17th century America, and then there was sort of the same conception we also see down in the Caribbean. And basically, there's this notion. It involves a lot more than just same-sex relations, but it's sort of this almost utopic kind of notion. It often involves the articles of piracy, which again, I don't want to get too far off topic, but basically it's everyone kind of weighs in, everyone is equal, and when everyone is equal in something like that, when you have the same sort of thing, you have this brotherhood that gets formed, and it's often even referred to as like the brotherhood of pirates or the brotherhood of piracy. You welcome someone into the brotherhood, and we get a lot of language that involves both family, but also this notion of like particular friends, if you will, and so there's this anything goes notion. Basically says, when everything is equal and we're all outside the law anyways, anything also goes. So everyone is equal. And so we have lots of notices, especially from places like Tortuga, which again is further south in the Caribbean, and Port Royal. One of the reasons people claim that it sank was because of this notion of the brotherhood of piracy, right? Is that you were viewed as an equal, and as a result, if you were an equal man or woman, you could sleep with one another. You all got your own share. Cross-dressing was very frequent and was done all the time. We have people like Anne Bonny, for example, who was seen as an equal with Jack Rackham, and they were known to sleep together, but she also slept with Mary Read. And so this whole concept, it's where we get the term mate from, in a way, when you think of it as a pirate, right? Not so much the first mate, which is a ship, but it takes that and it perverts it to basically have someone be like your mate or your kin or your brother. And I don't want to, because I could go on this for hours, I also don't want to cut you off, Michael, for whatever you want to add.
Right. So I just wanted to add two quick things, right? Is that we know from the writings of Herman Melville and from many other writings that maybe not pirates, but men who went to sea had lots of sex on the ships, right? And everybody always said historically, this goes back to the evolution of like scholarship, right? Well, of course they did, because they were at sea for 6 months and there were no women, so of course the men had sex with one another. And there's a great insight from Leslie Fiedler, the literary critic, who said, well, maybe they went to sea so that they could actually have sex with men on the ship for 6 months, rather than seeing the sex between men as an act of isolation from women, right? It really was like, that's why they went away, right? But this notion, right, that I'm thinking of the famous line, the famous quote from Winston Churchill, who said that the British Navy was put together by the lash, rum, and sodomy.
Yes.
Right, which I suspect may have been true in pirate times of 1730, as well as Winston Churchill's time in 1920.
Well, and I mean, and that goes back to the accusations, right, where they're saying, well, you know, the reason so many of us in the British Royal Navy were committing these sodomitical acts is because of the Portuguese, right? Because they did it, so we did it. You know, they taught us everything they knew about sailing, and that included how to have sex with men, which makes no sense. But, you know, again and again, we see it in the testimonies as well, right? And so it is this thing that just seems to be, it's, you know, seafaring and same sex interactions just seem to go together.
Right.
But it's this notion of this utopic equality that goes with it, in a way, especially maybe not in general with like the British Navy, but with regards again to this pirate community that's off the coast, right? It's so much more than just the whole, you know, when women are few, a man will do. It's not really that, because we know there were women pirates. It really is this notion, this utopic notion of we all split everything in equals. And if you lost a leg, you get a little bit more treasure, things like that. That same notion in the Articles of Piracy were also like, yeah, you guys fought side by side, you bled side by side. Why can't you lay side by side?
I think we're going to need to do a whole panel on piracy after. I'm so fascinated and I want to learn more. We're closing out our hour, so I do just want to ask one final question to our panelists, which is, in what direction, a two-parter, in what direction do we see the research and, like we talked about, our own perspectives evolving to approach the research and interpretation of where we're going in this field about LGBTQ history in America? And what can colonial Americans who marched to their own drum, who lived as authentically as they could, who undertook great personal risk to live the lives that they needed to live, what can they teach us about relationships and human behavior?
Sure. I'll take the first question very briefly, so we end on time. Right. I think that it's amazed me. I mean, gay liberation started in 1969. Nobody had written a book like Queer History of the United States until 2011, even though there had been some primary source document thing. The field is wide open. There's still, I'm sure Megan will attest to this, there's so much more to actually discover. I feel we've barely scratched the surface of it, right? And that goes hand in hand, right, with the evolution of how, and the sophistication, the increasing sophistication of how we're actually able to deal with this material. Because I think that even in the past 25 years, we've come an enormous way in being more insightful and more sophisticated in not only finding it, but in interpreting it. Megan, what can they teach us?
I think that they can teach us that, you know, they were seeking community back in the 18th century under the threat of capital punishment, and they were still trying to find one another, right? And that's beautiful. And, you know, we have these aching, heartbreaking stories of people who on the gallows, rather than repenting, share a last kiss. And that sort of courageous in the face of death, right? That's also inspiring, and it should also let us know how far we've come. But then when you look, at how much there's still to do, right? We should also take everything they did and use it as a motivator to keep going. These are people who shared a last kiss on the gallows, and we often don't know their names. We know Molly houses existed, and no one has done any archaeology of them. And yet we have done so much archaeology for all of these famous individuals, countless excavations, right? So I think we should also take that courageous spirit and we should use it to move forward, because there's so many stories we still need to tell.
Thank you so much for that, Megan. And to that point, thank you for the work that you are doing on the Molly houses. I really encourage all of our audience today to check out Dr. Megan Victor, to check out Dr. Michael Bronski, read their books, follow them on social media. They are such amazing leaders in this field. And I Googled them for hours and just loved reading their words and all the interviews that they have given. This was just so wonderful and so special. And I really look forward to approaching this more. I want to leave us, before I do my little closer that we all know and love, with that quote again from Tony Kushner, which is that the world only spins forward and we will be citizens. The time has come. So this is our little doing our great work here at Revolutionary Spaces today to give more visibility and a platform to LGBTQ+ history. Thank you again, Dr. Victor, Dr. Bronski, and thank you to our esteemed audience. Thank you to the Lowell Institute, without whom we could not be producing these amazing public programs for you. And just two things to keep in mind that we have coming up at the end of the month. We will be doing another virtual panel about what are the bounds of a society and who are the we when we talk about we in society. And we're going to be looking at that through the journey and the struggle for DC statehood. And we will be having some panelists who are DC statehood activists, and we'll be talking to them about the work that they are doing. So we're really excited for that. Keep an eye out on the website, www.revolutionaryspaces.org, throughout the summer. We have a lot of really fun stuff coming up in the summer that we will be announcing in the next couple of weeks. So please do keep an eye on that, and mark your calendars. On September 22nd, we have our inaugural gala. So if you like a good party, we hope you can join us. Again, Dr. Victor, Dr. Bronski, humbled, a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time. And I hope to see you back online or even in person, hopefully sometime soon. And I guess I'm going to get to work researching some pirates now, is what I'm going to do. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yep. Thank you so much for coming.